girlfriend introduced me to her family as just a friend even after years together. But later I discovered she was engaged to someone else chosen by them. And the reason she hid everything from me was more heartbreaking than any betrayal. I'm 23 years old, my name's Elias, and for the past 3 years I've been in a relationship that I thought was the closest thing to real love I'd ever have, the kind that takes root quietly in your life and before you know it, becomes the anchor you can't imagine drifting without. But the way things have unraveled lately has made me question everything I thought I knew about trust, about family, and honestly, about myself. Because the girl I'd built my world around, Marielle, she's 24 now, introduced me to her family not as the man who knew her secrets, who held her when she couldn't sleep, who carried the weight of her dreams and her pain, but as just a friend, a harmless buddy from college. And in that moment I smiled and nodded like it didn't rip something out of me, like it wasn't humiliating to shrink into that role after years of building something sacred between us. And I keep replaying that evening over and over in my head, trying to catch the exact moment where my gut should have told me that everything I believed about us wasn't real, that maybe I was just a placeholder in her story, someone who filled a gap until her family's expectations took over. But at the time, I brushed it off, convincing myself that maybe her parents were traditional, maybe she wasn't ready to open up about us, maybe there was some explanation that would make it less brutal, because that's what love does, right? It makes you bend until you don't recognize your own spine, it makes you excuse things you swore you'd never tolerate. And I thought if I just gave her time, she'd stand up for us, for me, for what we'd built. But looking back, I realized that night at her parents' dinner table in Providence, Rhode Island, should have been my warning, should have been the alarm bells so loud I couldn't ignore it, yet I did. Because when you're young and in love, you don't want to see betrayal hiding behind someone's smile. You just want to believe. And I believed her every time she squeezed my hand under the table when her mom asked about my plans after graduation, like I was just some classmate tagging along. Believed her when she whispered, "I'll explain later," into my ear as her dad poured me a glass of wine and asked what my family did for a living. Believed her when her younger brother, Matteo, 19 and still with that restless energy of someone figuring out who they are, cracked a joke about Marielle always bringing home strays. And everyone laughed, even me, though. Inside my chest it felt like something was splintering. Because in that house, in that moment, I wasn't her boyfriend, I wasn't her partner. I wasn't the person who spent countless nights helping her study for nursing exams or listening to her cry about the pressures she felt from her parents. I was a convenient lie she told to keep peace at the table. And the worst part was I let her do it. I sat there and swallowed my pride because I loved her too much to cause a scene, too much to risk her parents turning their disapproval on her. But the drive home that night was one of the longest of my life, her hand resting on mine on the center console like nothing was wrong, the city lights blurring past the windshield as my throat burned with words I couldn't get out. And when I finally asked, quietly, why she didn't just tell them the truth about us, she sighed and said, "You don't understand, Eli, it's complicated." And that was it. No real explanation, no reassurance, just those 3 words that have echoed in my mind ever since. And I wanted to push, I wanted to demand answers. But the way her voice cracked, the way she stared out the window instead of at me, it shut me down, made me swallow my anger because I was afraid of losing her, afraid that pushing too hard would drive her away. So I told myself I could wait, I could give her the space she clearly needed, even though deep down I felt something dark gnawing at the edges of what we had. And in the weeks after that dinner, I started noticing things I used to ignore. The way her phone was always on silent around me, the way she brushed off questions about her weekends at home, the way she avoided introducing me to any extended family even though I brought her to my cousin's wedding, my mom's birthday, even Sunday cookouts with my dad who doesn't open up to anyone but actually took a liking to her. And yet, when it came to her life, I was always kept in the shadows, and I told myself it was just family pressure, cultural differences maybe, but the truth was simmering beneath all of it. And when it finally surfaced, it wasn't just betrayal, it was heartbreak dressed as duty, the kind of truth that makes you wonder if love is enough when someone's carrying a weight heavier than anything you can compete with. And I think the reason I didn't walk away sooner is because every moment we spent together away from her family felt so real, so undeniable. Like the nights we'd lie on my tiny apartment floor, eating Chinese takeout straight from the cartons, her hair spilling across my arm as we made stupid plans about moving to Seattle or San Diego, starting over somewhere far from expectations, and she'd laugh and say, "You and me against the world," and I believed it with every cell in my body. So when the cracks started showing, I patched them with memories. I glued us together with hope. But all hope really did was blind me to the truth that she wasn't mine to begin with, not fully, not in the way I thought. Because while I was building a future with her in my head, her family was building one for her without me. And the night I finally discovered what that future was, Everything inside me collapsed like it was made of glass. The night I found out the truth wasn't some melodramatic reveal or some screaming, crying confrontation. It was even less than that, almost cruel in how ordinary it was at first, and that's why it still hangs in my chest like a shard of glass even today, because it started with me thinking that I'd surprise Marielle on a Saturday afternoon. She'd said she had a family commitment and couldn't stop by, and I remember sitting in my little car out in front of her apartment building in Pawtucket, with a box of cannolis from the bakery she loved, just waiting for her to text me when she came in. And the longer I waited, the more I got anxious, so I figured maybe I'd just leave them on her doorstep as a nice surprise, nothing heavy, just a way of letting her know I was thinking about her. But as I walked up, I saw her cousin, Nadia. I'd met her once at a college event, coming out of the building with flowers in hand, and she stopped when she saw me and her face went white, like she'd been busted stealing. And I knew in that moment that something was wrong, something that she didn't think I'd stumble into, so I asked, half joking, "What's the occasion?" And her voice cracked when she said, "Oh, just family thing," and ran off, and my stomach dropped because I've always had a good sense of reading people. And she wasn't lying to me, she was terrified of me discovering, so instead of leaving the cannolis on the door, I went up, and when I turned onto Marielle's floor, I could hear voices, laughter, clinking glasses, the kind of thing that doesn't belong in an average Saturday. And when I knocked, heart pounding so hard I swear I blacked out for a second, it wasn't Marielle who came to the door, it was her dad, some tall dude with serious eyes who gave me the once-over like I was nobody. And beyond him the apartment was full of people, relatives, family, friends, women in dresses, men in suits, and in the middle of them all was Marielle, standing in this pale blue dress I'd never seen her wear before, her hair done up in some way that made her look older, more put together, and next to her, his arm wrapped around her waist, was some guy I'd never laid eyes on in my life before, maybe late 20s, tall, sharp jaw, the kind of guy you'd see in some professional photo shoot. And the moment her eyes landed on mine, I swear the air was sucked from my lungs, because she didn't look shocked, she didn't even look guilty, she looked destroyed, like she'd been waiting for this moment and praying it would never come. And before I could even try to wrap my head around what was happening, her dad's voice boomed over the noise, firm and final. "This is a private gathering," and he started shutting the door. But Marielle sprang forward, grabbing my arm, pulling me into the hall, her hands trembling as she whispered, "Eli, please, not here, I'll tell you everything, just please leave." And I wanted to yell, to scream for answers, to pull her out of that apartment and make her tell me why she was standing next to some other dude like he was hers. But the desperation in her eyes, the way her voice broke on the word please, it paralyzed me, and all that got out was, "Who is he?" And she bit down so hard on her lip that I worried she might bleed before she whispered, He's my fiancé." And those words felt like they tore through the marrow of my bones, because fiancé isn't some casual word, it's a promise, it's a life, it's everything I thought we were building together. But apparently, she was building with someone else, and my first reaction was anger, white hot and blinding, because how could she make me think in us for years when she's standing here already committed to someone? But beneath the anger was something heavier, something that weighed on my shoulders that I couldn't shake, because the face she wore wasn't the face of a woman who was proud of an engagement. It was the face of a woman caught, and that uncertainty, was she betraying me, or was she broken by something bigger than us, kept me from walking away right then and there. So instead I whispered, "Why?" And she shook her head, tears welling but not falling, her voice so small I almost didn't hear it when she said, "I'll tell you later, I swear, just not here." And before I could push her, her brother Mateo emerged into the hallway, giving me an angry glare like I was some trespasser or something, and he said, "You should go, man," his voice hard and protectively. And I wanted to fight, I wanted to stand my ground, but the way Marielle squeezed my hand, silently begging me to leave, it shatters me another way. So I left. I walked away down those stairs with the cannoli box still in my hand, my legs numb, my chest hollow, the sound of their laughter ringing after me like some vicious soundtrack. And when I got into my car, I didn't even start it for almost 20 minutes. I just sat there looking at that bakery box till the grease stains started seeping through, and I thought about all those nights I'd spent with her, all the words we'd spoken in the dark, and how every one of them now felt like a lie. But at the same time, something in me knew it wasn't that simple, because the look in her eyes wasn't the look of someone who didn't love me, it was the look of someone who was shattering inside, and that contradiction was worse than any clean betrayal, because it meant I couldn't just hate her and move on, I had to know, I had to understand why. And that need for reasons is what sucked me back into her world when I should have cut myself loose, because the truth, when I finally got to it, was more heartbreaking than anything I could have ever conceived, and I don't think I'll ever remember the night she finally told me. I didn't hear from her for almost 3 days after that night, and those 3 days dragged out into years in my chest, because every time my phone buzzed with some empty text message I leapt up thinking it might be her. But it never was, and between rage and sorrow, I ripped back and forth, between blocking her number and taking a midnight drive to her apartment just to get a glimpse of her face. But when her name finally came onto my screen on a Tuesday night late, all that anger I had been rehearsing dissolved away into relief, because all I responded was, "Where are you?" And 20 minutes later she stood at my door, hair mussed, eyes puffy as if she hadn't slept, and when I opened it she simply stood there wrapped around herself as if she was afraid of falling apart, and all I could do was stand back and let her in. No questions asked, no words, just the soft creak of her taking off her shoes as if she'd done 100 times before. Except this time she wasn't the girl who laughed at me for having dishes sitting in the sink or sprawling on my couch with ramen noodles and Netflix. She was full of something so heavy it curled her whole body in on itself, and I could sense it in the way she sat perched at the edge of my bed without looking at me, her hands twisting in her lap, her lips quivering as if every word she wanted to say were stuck in her throat. And finally I broke the silence, my voice rough but shaking. "Tell me what's going on, Marielle. Just tell me the truth." She flinched as if she'd taken a slap in the face from the word truth, and for a moment I thought she'd lie again, might spin another fuzzy lie. But then she looked up at me through tears streaming down and breathed, "I never wanted you to know like that." And the way her voice shook made me hurt, still furious as I was, because it didn't sound like guilt at all, but like sadness, as if she grieved for us before I knew why. And she took a deep breath, the kind you do before you jump into freezing water, and said, "Eli, my engagement, it's not about love. It's about survival." I thought she was being over the top, that it was some twisted way of rationalizing lying to me. But as she started to talk, fragments of her life I never saw, the things she kept hidden under laughter and late-night chats, began spilling out, and the portrait they painted was unlike the girl I knew. She talked of her family, how her parents had migrated to the States from Guatemala with nothing, how every choice they'd made since then was about security, status, survival in a country that never really accepted them, and how she, as the oldest daughter, was the one who had to provide for their future, repay all the sacrifices they'd made. And this fiancé, his name was Adrian, 28, son of a prosperous businessman her parents were familiar with, wasn't chosen because she loved him but because his family could offer stability for hers, a deal that meant her parents' debt settled, her younger brother able to attend college without loans, her mother's medical bills covered, things she felt she had no right to say no to without breaking the people who raised her. And as she said it, I just sat there in stunned silence, my fury dissipating and leaving me with something worse. Helplessness. Because what do you say to the person you love when they tell you that they're selling out their heart for the survival of their family? Part of me wanted to shake her, tell her she didn't have to give herself up, that we could do it together. But another part of me, the part raised by a dad who worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on, who taught me family came first no matter what, got her in a way that made me sick, because I couldn't even blame her, not really. And that was the worst part of all, knowing she hadn't stopped loving me, that she wasn't betraying me because she wanted to, but because she believed she had no choice. And when finally she cried apart in my arms, whispering, "I wanted to tell you so many times, but I couldn't," I clung to her though every inch of me screamed I should let her go. Because how do you cling to someone who's already promised to someone else? And yet how can you let someone go crying in your arms like they're the only place left to them in the world? And I don't know I've ever felt more ripped apart in my life, so torn between love and pride, between needing to fight for her, and knowing I might be fighting a war I could never win. And as the night went on, we just lay there silent, her head on my chest, my fingers tracing the curves of her hair, both of us faking for a few stolen hours that the world outside didn't exist, even though we knew morning would arrive, and with it the reality that no matter how much we loved each other, love wasn't enough to overcome the weight of duty and tradition crushing down on her. And maybe that's the hardest thing I've ever had to learn, that sometimes love doesn't lose because it wasn't strong enough, but because the world demanded too much of the person you loved, and they gave it everything, even if it meant breaking both of your hearts. The weeks that followed were a blur of contradictions, like living in 2 separate worlds that never crossed but somehow existed mine. Because during the day I would try to focus on work, on getting through my last semester of school, on pretending to my friends that I was fine. But at night Maria would show up at my apartment, or I'd find myself at hers, and we'd collapse back together like nothing was ever wrong, speaking in hushed I love yous, sharing a bed, eating the same takeout we always ate. But beneath it all was this ticking clock, this awareness that our time was not infinite, that every laugh, every kiss, every moment was borrowed from a future where she would not be mine. And it did something to me, it starved me in a way I couldn't even articulate, because I wasn't losing her, I was watching her come apart in slow motion, and knowing she still loved me made it so much harder to let her go, and I'd find myself asking things I had no right to ask. Would she actually go through with the wedding? Would Adrian treat her well? Would she ever regret having stayed with me? And every time I looked at her, I could see in her eyes the answer. Yes, she was in love with me, but yes, she was still going to do it, because she loved me really, but she loved her family better. And what can you do with such a truth? I tried to confide in my best friend, Noah, 24M, a man who's been my buddy since high school, and when I finally spilled the beans one night over beers in his backyard, he shook his head and said, "Man, you can't keep doing this to yourself. You're burning yourself alive to heat her up." And I hated hearing it because it was true, because each day that I opted for her, I was choosing pain for myself. But not being with her felt like it was asking me to breathe without lungs, and the day invitations to her engagement party went out, I saw one on her counter when I came over, gold embossed with her name and his, and I felt something in me shatter, because it wasn't some distant future anymore, it was real, and she caught me staring at it and said, "Don't hate me." And I wanted to laugh because hate was the last thing I felt. It was love, so much love it hurt to hold, love that was devouring me alive from the inside out because it had no place to go. And that night I finally asked the question I'd been sidestepping. If it was just you, no family, no pressure, what would you choose? And with no hesitation she whispered, "You, always you." And to hear that should have been comforting, but it shattered me all over again, because it meant everything between us was everything we had no control over. And I saw then that sometimes the most agonizing betrayals aren't the ones that come out of lies or cruelty, but the ones that come out of love abandoned at the altar of something greater. And that's when I knew I couldn't keep playing this charade anymore, couldn't keep being the ghost in her life, because as much as I wanted to be selfish, as much as I wanted to beg her to split with me, I loved her too much to ask her to choose between me and the family that raised her. So the night the last we spent together I held her closer than ever before, memorizing the curve of shoulder under my palm, the sound of breathing in sleep, the heat of pressed against mine. And when the sun crept through the blinds the next morning I kissed her forehead, whispered, "I'll always love you," and left before she awakened because if I'd seen her eyes I wouldn't have had the strength. And going out of her apartment that morning felt like pulling chains behind me, each step slower and heavier than the last. But I knew it was the only way I'd survive. And maybe it's stupid, maybe it's weak. But even now, months later, I don't regret that I loved her, not for an instant. Because she taught me what it feels like to love without restraint, to give yourself and take your chances. And she taught me, too, that sometimes love isn't enough. And that's a thing I wish I never had to learn, but one that I'll carry around with me for the rest of my life. And when I hear through the grapevine she's married now, that she looks happy in photos standing next to a man who can offer her family the world, I don't let myself resent her for it. I don't let myself resent him either, because in another world, in another iteration of this universe, she and I made it. She and I had the happily ever after. But in this one, all I can do is let her go and hope the love we shared, even if it wasn't strong enough to win, was strong enough to be remembered. And maybe that's the most human thing of all, to love someone this deeply and yet walk away, carrying both the pain of what could have been and the quiet gratitude for what was.